One interesting post I put up today was, not today, a few days ago, about training intent. Now, this was triggered by a client that I noticed wasn't performing ideally, and we can start seeing her RP was going a bit backwards from session to session, even though we're in quite a low volume, low intensity program. So there's zero need to be heading backwards, and it seems to be quite common with everyone really. That the intent of our lifting is a difficult thing to overcome. Generally, to like overthinking or paralysis by analysis, fiddling around too much and not treating the bar with, I would call it, respect.
Respect, yeah. So, what it can go both ways then, right? So, like, there are some people who overanalyze and overthink the lift, and then there are other people who don't give enough attention at all, are not going through the cues, or just can't be bothered. You know, the people who rock up to the bar like, oh, fuck, you know.
So to put this in perspective, when we're looking at the psychology of an individual, we're starting on the far left side as someone who is laid back, very laid back.
Right.
And on the complete other opposite end, the most extreme will be someone who is hysterical. And in between are stages, such as like coming from very laid back to, or someone worse than laid back, or more on the spectrum on laid back is pretty much falling asleep. Right. Then we come up to being someone who's laid back, and then we move up to someone who's slightly aroused, performing optimally.
Right.
Then on the opposite end, we have, if we start to go beyond that arousal spectrum, we move to being anxious, to panic, to hysterical. Now, we all naturally sit on this spectrum somewhere.
Yeah.
And we need to generally move our psychology to where it is optimal for performance. So if we're too far laid back, we need to teach ourselves to focus up, but get a bit more tunnel vision, get a little bit more height to increase arousal, to then increase performance. And on the opposite spectrum, if we have someone who is anxious, then we need to learn how to calm them down, clear their mind, how to stop overanalyzing and overthinking, or how to stop rushing into a set. So these people need to be more purposeful compared to other people who may need to get a little bit more aggression. So I've observed this with velocity. So velocity is a measure of neural output or neural drive.
Yeah.
And you can see its effect on performance instantaneously, and gives you instant feedback on that. So, and the biggest thing that influences velocity, I found at working loads, is intent, training intent. So even more so, obviously technique plays a very, very big role. The secondary function then is psychology.
Right.
So especially when we're focusing on building our strength up. Obviously in the early stages when we're trying to build technique, the focus is technique. Other than that, if you find someone who requires more arousal, if they coming in and just lifting the weight with no purpose other than just lifting, they'll still hit their numbers, but we'll generally see a drop off in velocity. It won't be within the ideal ranges that we initially tested at. So this means we end up having a disparity with the ideal velocity with the load we're trying to lift. So this can carry over to not lifting within our maximal threshold of that load, right? Which means reduced kilowatts of power towards the muscle, which means less intramuscular tension built through the muscle, which is just then less likely to build the motor units required to maximize contraction. Stimulus happens right near the end range of the power of our power output.
Right.
So even if we lift at 80%, yes, we're not at our maximal load, but we need to lift at maximal velocities. And this...
Right. So what you're saying there is that basically two lifters or the same lifter could go through the same program, hit the same weights throughout the training, but the person with the better intent, who would therefore work at the correct velocities, at the higher end of the velocities, would actually make more gains across. Yeah, even though on paper they've lifted the same amount, right?
Yes. So yeah, on paper they'll lift the exact same amount, but the stimulus will be greater for an individual who lifts much higher at that threshold, or much closer to that threshold. Yeah. So regardless of them measuring or not, people should have this intent and start to know this feel and start to know how this feels. You can use this subjectively with RPE as well. I mean, we've got to try and make these weights feel like a lighter RPE. So if something feels like a 9, how do you make it feel like an 8 or a 7?
Yeah.
So, but with velocity, I have been able to measure on both ends of the spectrum. So so on the other opposite end, we have found some people they found they lift better when they decided to calm down or had less people around them. So people with hype do better with people around them.
Right, so I was about to ask that. Do you find that team training mitigates a lot of this? So it's different for different people. Some people need to train, don't need to train alone, but that would benefit them.
But that builds the environment for them to train optimally. Yeah. So a lot of people feed off that. So just on general psychology of introverts and extroverts that we were talking about earlier, is that extroverts get energy from social interactions, where introverts lose energy.
I'm definitely an introvert.
But in cases when we're trying to hype arousal, it can be different in that situation. So in some lifts, I do better with people around, and some lifts it doesn't overly bother me. Essentially, for me, I require more hype in a deadlift than I do in a squat and bench press.
Interesting. So it varies lift to lift. So how do you mitigate that? If you've got somebody who needs the hype toned down, how do you deal with that at competition? Because obviously the competition environment is all eyes are on the platform, music going, announcer.
To not get caught up in hype rituals.
Right. Okay.
So this is like the screaming, the slapping, the ammonia, the hyper caffeine intake, and literally meditative exercises that can bring down that arousal because it's already there. All right. So they don't have to do much to be in an ideal range, and essentially they should be spending most of their time calming down. Now it can get very hyper tuned for some individuals where they require a level of hype and then have to tune it back a little bit. So a lot of my female clients is that we end up hyping them up a bit, and then before they get to the bar, I actually teach them to then slow back down, breathe. So they have the adrenaline pumping, but they're more focused, and that tends to bring them back in a really ideal range. Now this takes time to work out what it is.
Right. So I was going to say to have that level of specificity. So you're not just doing it based on lift and based on person. You're doing it based on moment within the actual lifting process. From walking up to the bar.
It can get as fine tuned as looking at every sequence of the lift from the moment they have decided to go and start their set to the end. So when do they put on their belt? When do they chalk? What are they thinking about how they applying the chalk to their hands? So when I'm in that hype, I am quite aggressively applying my chalk. Because that starts to build the sequence in the brain to tell you that you're getting ready to do some sort of intensity. So this starts the mental cues, and if you've done this process enough times, you've trained your brain to anticipate what is going to happen. And so, just like in any situation, let's take an evolutionary perspective. If we start doing certain things in the wild that we know are going to trigger responses that could heighten an adrenaline response, such as trying to, like in a hunting situation, the situation is very similar here. Is that we're trying to create the fight or flight response,
right? Yeah.
And manipulate manipulate that essentially. So the sequences we take to the bar also matters. So we even notice to the point how long it takes someone to go through their sequence, if even how they hold the bar. So if they hold in a sequence, let's say I go underhand over, overhand over, then I readjust the grip. Once twist, lift. Now, if I add a fourth sequence to my hand because I feel my grip is off, the lift will not move nowhere near as well. It'll instantly drop because I've also created a level of doubt and doesn't work within the sequence I've trained my brain to do.
Yeah, so I felt like if I usually feel it in the squat, sometimes I'll come off the rack, I'll be ready to go into my first rep, and then I'll have to rearrange my feet again. It just feels slightly off, and then the whole set's ruined. So in that situation, do you recommend re-racking, starting again?
So no, you should commit. You should learn to commit.
Yeah. Okay.
So there's two exercises I do with this. So there's exercise number 1 is visualization exercises.
Yep.
So visualize what you're going to do. Now, not just like thinking about what you're doing, but actually visualize every single step that you're going to take and how that step's going to feel. What cues are you going to use and how that's going to feel under the bar. Now, once you've achieved that, then do the lift.
Right.
All right. And then your brain will go through that sequence. So when you do visualize, you have to visualize exactly how you're going to do it under the bar. Once you get under the bar, you can also create points of no return. So meaning that once you've taken your breath in, or you've set your hips, or you grab the bar, you say you go no matter what. So you don't let the thinking interrupt the pattern. Because the movement pattern doesn't start from just the movement. The movement pattern, the preparation for the movement to be executed well, is within the entire ritual itself.
Yeah.
And so we start to, again, once you've touched the bar, you don't stop. So you'll see people, if you watch some people who are experts at this, and you watch every single deadlift they've ever posted, or overhead press, or bench press, or whatever it is, their sequence are exactly the same. No matter what. Like, freakishly the same, even to the point how they might have their little idiosyncrasies of like how they people have a little foot twist before they squat. They will always do it. It's these rituals that allows them to lift. If they didn't do that, it would throw them off. They would still get the lift, but these guys are trying to lift at their most ideal level of performance.
Yeah, so I know this actually comes across a lot of sports, especially when. I mean, the thing off the top of my head is in team sports, anytime you've got a place kicking situation, it's like you're doing a conversion in rugby or something, they have the ritual they go through. But I can imagine, I know visualization and all that stuff is massively prioritized in the Olympic sports, especially in the throwing events and things like that. Like they're heavily ritualized. And I know it is in Olympic lifting as well. Like
I think any power or strength sports. I mean, throwing's a strength sport, but it's on the speed spectrum. You know, where we are on the power spectrum side of strength.
Yeah.
So, but the intent and intensity is exactly the same. They all are difficult feats of strength.
Do you think that intent affects? Do you see that any times where the intent affects how well the mechanics go, rather than just the power output?
In both ways. So if you're too hyper aroused, you can end up having worse technique. People will end up doing some weird stuff when they have their anxiety levels higher. They panic a lot. One of their sequences that they're doing, that they've panicked, and it changes the way they lift, or they think it feels better if they change something right now, when the best thing they can do is stay calm and follow what their training has done. And then on the opposite side of things, for people without hype, it's more to do with power, but I think their intent and intensity behind their ability to create stability, tension, and executing it well, rather than just getting up and down.
Yeah, okay.
But I find it more so the technique is affected by people who are on the more anxiety side of the spectrum. If they don't calm down, their technique generally falls out the window. Yeah.
So this would be something, that end of the spectrum would be a significant issue at competition time, right? Like,
Yes.
those people crumble when the pressure's on. So
Yes.
your goal is to completely remove the pressure where possible.
So more train them in that condition.
Okay.
So individuals who have that, I'd give them more exposure of that coming into competition.
So basically make them do weekly kind of comps in training, make sure people are watching.
And normally it does depend on the population, because a lot of the individuals who fall into that spectrum are also the same neural type that can handle higher loads.
Right.
And so we get away with more maximal work, and so we can put them in that stimulus of maximal loads, and a lot closer to competition as well, to get them used to that environment, and also to start fine-tuning their psychology. So we'll do it, and we'll notice that this was a bit off. How do we improve that? What are some of the things that they did? What did I notice? And we can start to address that. So not just getting ready for competitions, not just getting ready for just for the lift. It's also getting your mental preparation throughout the competition and all the way up to the lift.
Yeah, because the environment is something to prepare for in itself, because it's not something that can easily be replicated in the training environment, can it?
No. We have to teach them to understand that they can't control everything in their environment.
Yeah.
So we have to expose them to things that are going to create some chaos. And how do we keep them focused under that pressure?
So how do you introduce chaos? Obviously, safely.
You can put them into a team training environment.
Yeah.
Where lifts have to be done at a certain time, and it's your turn. You've got to be ready. You can't choose when you're on the bar. You have to follow the competition. And it's the same thing goes when we do team training. We'll get them all to test. We get them all to test together. We'll try and replicate a competition environment as much as we can. So having them all turn up at the same time for testing night, they have to work with other people on the same monolift or same bar, and create a little bit of chaos within that. And we'll see how they handle under pressure, and it gives us a bit of an idea about what they need to do, on how they need to apply their psychology at a competition. And then obviously the competition itself can be different again.
Yeah.
But this is also where people should, especially new athletes, should do more competitions within their first year.
Right, okay.
And not to take the competitions crazy seriously. They should focus on their competitions being practicing competitions, and that's it. If they can just improve on themselves, improve their lifting from competition to competition, and enjoy it, then that's the first steps they need to take in terms of trying to become a really good powerlifter. No matter what the goal, if the goal, or in terms of taking up a powerlifting career, so if their goal wants to be, I want to compete at the biggest competitions ever, and they haven't started yet, the process is that. Essentially get them competing a lot.
Compete.
And actually get them to focus on just self-improvement. Because if they're just going to focus on the big end goal, then that is quite, for someone who might be on that high end of anxiety spectrum, can be constantly disappointed from competition to competition. We can't have that, because that's not going to create the psychology we need for someone who needs to be elite. We need someone who needs to be elite and needs to know how to pace themselves for very long periods of time, to take all the shit over extreme periods.
Yes.
And how to manage it.
We've talked about that before, that the kind of long-term thinking, the process thinking, rather than the immediate kind of gratification side of it. Do you find a lot of coaches think that way though? Like, especially when it comes to taking athletes to competition?
In what way?
Do you find that coaches encourage their athletes to not worry about the result? Is that what you're seeing, or?
Well, everyone's different. There are some really good coaches out there, and some not so much. You can kind of pick out who they are without saying names. Essentially, for some coaches, you can see that they worry about what maximal numbers they can hit on the platform, and we can end up making stupid decisions for individuals who might not be used to that level of intensity. I'd always be conservative for someone who is higher in the spectrum of anxiety, to just focus on having a good time. And generally, if they do, they'll end up performing better.
Yeah, because they need to kind of get a comfort level with the competition.
And you got some coaches who think that every single client needs a whiff of ammonia and slap at the back of the head.
I mean, that is the stereotype. If you asked a person on the street, what a powerlifter's like, they'll mention ammonia chalk, screaming,
Yeah.
death metal. Like,
But they're not all like that. And again, it's fine tuning the psychology for each one. And me as a coach being adaptable to many personalities. Yeah, and that is hard for some coaches because people skills is a big one. And I'm not particularly natural at people skills, but it's something that I've studied a lot to try and help my clients, and obviously just my own social skills.
but I think it's easier for you because you treat it as a dimension to the problem that you're trying to fix, and whereas I think a lot of people are discounting it as something that contributes.
So yeah, well, I'm never going to be natural in a social situation. It is something I have actually read a lot and taught myself to do. So I actually use other parts of the brain to try and help with social interactions. I'm never going to be good. I'm always going to seem awkward, but I have a great understanding of or meaning behind those social interactions. Well, I've seen people with quite natural social talent miss a lot of these cues.
Yeah.
They're more like a chameleon in social situations where they can draw a lot of attention to themselves because it gives them energy. But someone like myself, it does not. For training, I try not to take more than one client. 2 clients sat me for training.
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually don't like to take clients before I train.
Right. Okay.
I rather work by myself on those days, and on my rest days is when I take all my clients.
Yeah.
Because it fries me. But I don't work with too many people. A lot of my stuff's online now. So
Yeah.
I think the last thing I would want to say is that to sum this up is that we all sit on the spectrum differently, and I have objectively measure the impact on it in the last year or two with velocity. Velocity being the objective measure of neural drive. Again, I've seen on both ends, I've seen people who've calmed down and increased up to 10, 15, at most 20% in power output simply by...
Oh, shit. Okay.
It's big. It's not just
Wow,
small.
it's huge.
Actually, in just a few weeks ago, we had one of our clients. She is on that anxiety side of the spectrum, and she was sitting on about 0.23 on her deadlift and 0.23 meters per second.
Yep.
So every 0.01 is roughly a 1% increase in performance. In that, in her final set, she had no one lifting around her. She wasn't rushing the set because people needed to work in the bar, and she was a lot calmer. And it went up to 0.43. So that was 11% increase in power.
Yeah.
11 is heaps.
That's massive.
It's massive.
11%.
Yeah. You think of that as 11% on your max, then that gives you the perspective.
Yeah.
If your max is 150, it is now potentially 165.
Which is huge.
Yeah.
Huge.
Training intent.